Black Talk Media Project would like to invite you to become a member of the BTR Community subscription-based social media platform. BTR Community is a platform that was set up for the listening audience of Black Talk Radio Network, the #1 independent Black radio network online. For just $24 per year, your subscription gives you access to an interactive space to share information with like-minded people with your privacy guaranteed. Your subscription will go a long way to help us maintain and improve our current media platforms. It will also help provide a budget so that we can begin the task of establishing localized media centers and radio stations across the United States. The best way to show your support and appreciation for what we do here at Black Talk Radio is to subscribe. Help us to help you be informed. Join btrcommunity.com today.
The views and opinions expressed by callers, guests, and hosts do not necessarily reflect those of the Black Talk Radio Network and Black Talk Media Project. Black Talk Radio is new black media for the new millennium.
Lift your eyes up, let your wise rise up. See the signs of the times if it's time. Rise up, rise up. When death and hell dwell among all God's people. When those we chose and trusted have become completely corrupted and inherently evil. When the feast that feeds you starves our father's children. When snuff, porn, and pedo forms begin to get top billing. Rise up. When famine claims millions. When justice gives blind eyes to billions. When the Lord's anger is no longer feared. If his protection is gone and your enemies are near. If you've seen the seas spill over and the mountains shake, break, and fall. If the moon ever turns blood red and you can't see the sun at all. Rise up. No matter if the prize is high in the skies.
Peace and welcome to New Abolitionist Radio on the Black Talk Radio Network, a program that seeks to educate, inform, and agitate on the issue of 21st century legalized slavery, hosted by social activist and spoken word poet Max Partis and Black Talk Media Project founder Scotty Reed. On this program, we discuss recent news on legalized 21st century slavery and human trafficking as it is practiced through the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, along with projects and people who help combat it. Today is the April 4th, 2018 broadcast of New Abolitionist Radio in our 6th season, and it's National Poetry Month. On this day in history, the shooting of Walter Scott occurred on April 4th, 2015 in North Charleston, South Carolina, following a daytime traffic stop for a non-functioning brake light. Scott, an unarmed black man, was fatally shot by Officer Michael Slager, who received 20 years in prison after the judge in the case said he viewed the shooting as a murder. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, treaty is signed. And in 1968, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. And then in 1928, Maya Angelou, American poet and author, was born. She once said, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." And I think both Scotty and I can relate to that quote. Our guest tonight is Steve Fishman. Steve Fishman is a longtime journalist for the New York Magazine for a decade and is now a podcaster. His previous podcast was on Bernie Madoff called Ponzi Supernova. His new podcast, Empire on Blood, is a 7-part series that launched on March 28th. It's about the journey he took with Calvin Buari, please correct me later if I say his name wrong, a man who was wrongfully convicted of murder and recently exonerated on March 21st, 2018, after 22 years in prison. Steve talks to everyone, the cops, the prosecutor, even the person he believes is the real killer. He takes listeners into the belly of the Bronx criminal justice system and explains why and how young black men have gotten incarcerated in such large numbers. During the Slave Catcher Chronicles tonight, we'll cover this bombshell headline revelation from this incarceration nation. It says, only black people have been prosecuted under Mississippi's gang law since 2010. In the lead up to this year's legislative session in Mississippi, supporters of a tougher gang law in the state talked a lot about the need to arrest white people, but in an ironic twist, the Jackson Free Press has learned that everyone arrested under the existing gang law from 2010 through 2017 were African American. Our abolitionist in profile tonight is Pashaw Beverly Randolph, October 8th, 1825 through July 29th, 1875. He was an African American medical doctor, an occultist, a spiritualist, a trance medium, an abolitionist, and a writer. He is notable as perhaps the first person to introduce the principles of erotic alchemy to North America, and according to A.E. White, established the earliest known Rosicrucian order in the United States. Our rider of the 21st Century Underground Railroad is Richard Phillips, a Detroit man whose murder conviction was thrown out after he spent 45 years in prison and was exonerated last Wednesday and won't face a second trial. As usual, we'll dissect and disseminate current news and events related to the 13th Amendment slavery from the perspectives of slavery abolitionists. So let's get started. If you got a question or a comment, you can call us at 704-802-5026. You can chat with us and others by logging in at uberconference.com, Black Talk Radio Network. Once again, I'm Max Parthas. What's happening, Brother Scotty?
Hey, greetings to you, Brother Max.
Man, I am kind of worn out tonight. I got to tell you, it's been a long day, but I'm worn out tonight, man. So my plan is just to ride along, try to have a great conversation with our guest, and then maybe try to take some of these stories and make sense out of them, you know?
Understandable. You know, I understand about being tired, man. Wednesday is Wednesday nights, and it's after the first. Been working on the reports for, our podcasters and programs on Black Talk Radio Network, all our YouTube videos and all that type of stuff, man. So, totally understandable. And then you spent, most of your afternoon with your wife at the hospital, and we know how tiring it can be in places like that, man. So it's totally understandable. I'll try to do my best.
It's good, man. Hey, I want to shout out about some links as well, too.
Sure.
This is the second anniversary of our project, The Incarceration Nation in Black and White. It was constructed not long after we did the America is Ferguson series. And based on the information and the research that we had went through that entire year, we put together this wonderful presentation featuring some of the best spoken word artists in the country, literally. And it shows the exact rates of incarceration for every state in the union based on black and white. And it's just mind-blowing to see it, and then to have those poets behind it, just really breaking it all down is awesome. So if you want to check that out, it's on New Abolitionist Radio right now. It's about 12 minutes long. It features 3 artists on it with all of the states combined. So that's one thing. And I heard day before yesterday, I was listening to the Tando show, and I heard my brother, after he listened to Freestyle, one of these tracks off of our CD Endgame, and I got to tell you, Scotty, I was humbled and very grateful for how he felt about that and the words that he said. Indeed.
I certainly feel the same way.
Yes. Thank you, brother. Yeah, we put our heart and soul into that CD Endgame. We spent nearly a decade putting it together with some of the greatest musicians and producers we could find in the whole country. And we wanted it to be something that would last through the ages. And we like to think that has been the case so far. So you can get that anytime you like from CD Baby. It goes under Max Impact, or you can find it on Amazon or any one of the major outlets for CDs. Just type in Maximum Impact Endgame. So, and that's 10 years to this month that it's been out, 10 years.
Yeah, I didn't know that it was part of a CD. I just know I came across the track on YouTube. I was like, man, I love this track, man.
No doubt. I think I sent you a few of them.
Yeah, you did.
Over time as well. So yeah, man. That's a couple of things that I wanted to tell people about. And then there was one other thing. It's Poetry Month, National Poetry Month. So I've been asking some of my artist friends and poets friends to focus on the 13th during Poetry Month and produce something for us, whether it be a poem or a song or whatever it may be. And they've been doing that. And I'm really appreciative of that. So I created a forum on Facebook temporarily, but we're going to move it to the Black Talk Radio Network very soon, called Abolitionist Art, Music, and Poetry. And I'll put that on New Abolitionist Radio. If you really want to be moved by some music and poetry, just go there and check it out. You would be surprised at what you find. And Scotty, that would be a great place for you to go ahead and find any tracks that you like to play on your message music.
Or I can, upload it to this digital station, Black Talk Radio, as well. So I'm definitely, I was just talking about on Tando Radio Show, The Power of Words, from a earlier conversation I was having with one of our network family members, Jenna out of Tennessee, man. And just the power of words, man. People, I think, underestimate the power of words. They underestimate the spoken word, and words have a lot of power behind them. And so it's great to hear that these poets were very receptive to you picking up, participating in this project focused on modern day slavery and human trafficking via the 13th Amendment.
Exactly. Every movement needs a soundtrack, brother, and we got some talented people out there that know the whole story. And they have been dropping some jewels, and they've been dropping them for a while now. So we got video music on there, written word, whatever you're looking for, you can find it there. And we'll also be putting up artwork from painters and sketchers and people who put things together in that form of art as well.
Well, we still have about 8 minutes before our scheduled guests will be joining us. I'll be actually calling them to connect them to the program. So, on this day in history, Dr. King was assassinated by a white terrorist, as so the story goes. But, of course, we know that there was a state-sponsored assassination because of the various things that Dr. King was working on. And, what are your thoughts on his legacy? I already, I had the host Tando because Dave is off until Monday, but I had the host Tando, and, I just really take issue with all of these different people, even people who knew Dr. King, who are misconstruing, who are connecting his legacy to things that he didn't even have a part of, like this gun, legislation or so-called anti-Second Amendment gun control movement that's out there.
My thoughts on what's going on with Martin Luther King Jr. right now is, I've done a lot of research on King, and I can't claim to be an expert on him, but I have seen some very rare speeches and read and listened to his words in search of him talking about abolition, because I had always wanted to know, what was it during that period of time where King and Malcolm were alive that the prison industrial complex was not an issue? And we know that convict leasing lasted all the way up until the 60s in South Carolina and 1928 in Alabama. So I was very curious, and I found some jewels where they both actually spoke on those issues to some small degree, but it wasn't the thing that people wanted to hear at the time. Really, for me, Martin Luther King Jr. his essence of what I believe he was can be summed up in two of his quotes. The first is this: nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that in the end, we will not remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Those two things together tell you what he was all about right there. He was fighting against the grain. Even his own people were betraying him to a very large degree. You had pastors and bishops out there who was siding with the white supremacists, like literally. And that opened the door for King to be, for them to be able to come on to King and surveil him in the way that he was doing without much complaint.
You just raised the issue.
Media.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Max.
Today's media exploits Martin Luther King Jr. Even his legacy is owned by the Ford companies and a few others like that. And his actual estate is so, I mean, they're so short on funds. At one time, the son was ready to sell the Bible, his personal Bible, and literally sued his sister in order to get that to happen. Fortunately, I think it ended up being declared that it was a national treasure, and they kept it with the estate. But literally, they were that broke, he was trying to sell his daddy's Bible. So they're exploiting his image, and they do that to all our heroes because they're trying to craft for us the perfect protester, the good Negro. This is how you should be. And then they'll point out his nice little words that they agree with, but they skip the stuff that I just mentioned in those two quotes completely. You won't hear that much. I might be the only guy you heard today who quoted that there's nothing in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity, because it points to people in their face that you are ignorant and stupid and doing this in a wrong way.
Yeah, and
so,
a lot of people,
the hell out of him.
Yeah, a lot, and they take his words out of context, and people just pick and choose. But it is most sad that his own children, not all of them, but some of them, have sold out his legacy, literally, as you were just talking about, but also ideologically. They sold, and then also those who were supposedly in his inner circle have sold out today and are on the other side. And one of the things, though, that came across my mind today, and you just reminded me because I forgot to bring it up. I was reading this article that was distorting King's legacy, like he was promoting black power through black business ownership. Certainly he recognized economic power and the power of the boycott and what have you. And he was not against black businesses, but I have never heard him talk about, black businesses. But one of the things that you just mentioned about even people in the black community was against him, when they went to Alabama and he was on his poverty tour, it was a lot of people who wanted to keep segregation in place because they were some of the very few black entrepreneurs at the time who were profiting from a captive market. They didn't have to compete with other businesses. So, of course, they called King a troublemaker. Oh, why you want to come down here and upset the order of things? And I read a quote earlier where he was talking about in his letter from a Birmingham jail that, we got some people who want order over justice.
Scotty, I don't know if it's me, but your voice seems to be going in and out. We can hear you, but it's...
Well, actually, I'm getting echo back from your line.
All right. So, yeah, man, they're exploiting the hell out of him. And I saw something that I felt ashamed of not too long ago, was during the March for Our Lives, where Martin Luther King Jr. III, which is the one that tried to sell the Bible, brought his granddaughter onto the CNN stand that they had there, which was talking about the marches itself. It had his granddaughter talk in a remove the Second Amendment stance. And I just felt some kind of way about that. I was like, wow. I mean, does she even know that Martin Luther King Jr. applied for a gun license and was refused? Because that was the issue they were dealing with. Remember racism?
Yeah.
People act like it's post-racial America. Yeah, the same thing is not happening right now.
The very first gun control was racist, and it was passed unless it was an earlier passage, but during the colonial time, the Virginia Slave Code stripped free black people of their gun ownership rights because the fear was that, hey, these black people that are not in slavery might feel some kind of way about slavery and use those guns to help end slavery, which they later did during the Civil War, which you correctly deemed the greatest slavery rebellion on the North American continent was the Civil War.
Yeah, it was almost as successful as Haiti. We didn't get a nation, but we got integration.
We actually prevented, like I mentioned to Jenna today, I said, if not for them, we'd be living in the Confederate States of America today.
Yes, and there is a series that is titled that, where you can go and see what it would look like. And they really do a good job of showing what it would look like. It's called the Confederate States of America. You can probably find it on YouTube. Amazing to see. Speaking of amazing, on Tando's show the other day when he was listening to Freestyle, I also heard him talking about some other things. And one of the things that he did was play a clip from, he wasn't the Attorney General at the time, but Eric Holder speaking about how they need to literally brainwash people about gun control and to do it every day in the schools using the students. And then I saw another video that I don't know if he saw it, but later on, because that was in 1995, but while he was the Attorney General, he was grilled in the Senate. And they asked him, they quoted what he said about brainwashing people, and they asked him what he meant. And he specifically said, I'm talking about young black men. I'm like, oh my God. Like you're hearing it from the horse's mouth. This is a plan they have been putting into action now since 1995 at least, in order to brainwash you into thinking a certain way. It's right. Amazing. I'm going to put the links to that on New Abolitionist Radio so you can hear with your own ears. And the Tando show broke it down in detail, but as I said, he might not have seen the follow-up video, which happened while he was the Attorney General. And he clearly said that I plan on brainwashing young black men.
Well, Max, we are joined by our guest, Mr. Steve Fishman, who is joining us on the line. So, Max, if you would like to introduce him once again, please do so.
Yes, indeed. Welcome to New Abolitionist Radio, Brother Steve Fishman. He's a longtime journalist and writer for New York Magazine, 10 years, right? And you're now a podcaster. And as I mentioned earlier, one of your podcasts was on Bernie Madoff, and you had it was called the Ponzi Supernova. You can find that, I believe, is it on YouTube?
No, it's on iTunes.
Or is it on your podcast? It's on iTunes, okay. His new podcast, Empire on Blood, is a 7-part series, and it was launched just this last March 28th. It's about the journey he took with, is it Buari?
Yeah, it's Calvin Buari. Yeah, Buari.
Buari, all right. Calvin Buari, a man who was wrongfully convicted of murder and recently exonerated on March 21st. Congratulations and welcome to freedom, brother. 2018, after 22 years in prison. And I like where they were saying this, and I found this in an article where it said that you talked to everybody, even the dude that you thought was the killer, the real killer. And then that you take listeners through the belly of the Bronx criminal justice system and explains why and how young black men have gotten incarcerated in such large numbers. That's the part right there that I really look forward to hearing, particularly in the light of a brother like Khalif Browder and what he had to go through.
Yeah, that's an incredibly tragic case. And, he fits in to a situation where you have cops who have a certain outlook, you have prosecutors who have a certain outlook, they have pressures on them coming from above. And I think now the case that I followed starts in the 90s, which was a particularly extreme time for this point of view, but it was really a moment where I think that people in authority said, well, if he didn't do this one, he did another. And so there was a kind of air of lock them up and let the warden sort it out. And, we're feeling the effects now, and we are seeing dozens and dozens and dozens of people, in particular, men who were young and in their 20s, I'm talking about in the 1990s now, who were swept up and became part of what I think is rightfully called a mass incarceration. A whole generation of young black men who were, now all of them weren't on the right side of the law at all the times. The man that I profiled, Calvin Buari, the man I really took this 7-year journey with, he was a drug dealer. He was a guy who was a very successful businessman. His business happened to be crack. But does that mean that you can then come along and say, I'm not going to arrest you for being a drug dealer, but I am going to arrest you for doing these 2 murders that you didn't commit. We can't live like that.
I would have to agree with you, Mr. Fishman, on that point. When I think about certain crimes, like in the drug war and what they deem crimes, I try to judge it on an individual basis. I call them, some of these are crimes of survival that are produced by poverty. When you look at racial discrimination and the historic unemployment, especially of black men, then, some people will turn to all that is left to them to do in order to make money to survive. Now, I don't know if that was his case, because I'm going to keep it real. I got a cousin. There was no reason. He wasn't living in poverty. It was no reason for him to deal drugs, but he was mesmerized by the glamorization of drug dealing in the media, in terms of this crap music that they call gangster rap, and then the different movies. And he told me, my little brother asked him, look, man, why you keep dealing these drugs? Ain't you made enough money? You're not, come from no poor family or nothing like that. You're not living in a hood. And he flat out said, I was addicted to it. I was addicted to the lifestyle. So, and also, I don't know if you are aware of the work of, what's the guy named Gary Webb, who wrote that series for, I think it was Mercury News at the time, which exposed the connections of the CIA to the cocaine trafficking, along with Ricky Freeway Ross, who has been quite open about, where he was getting his connections from to get that cheap cocaine. So, when before I condemn someone like Calvin Buari, I also had to consider these other things.
I think that's a fair point, and I think Calvin, the podcast is called Empire on Blood, and I spend a lot of time talking to Calvin, and I will say, I knew him later in life, so I've known him for 7 years. He did 22 years for this murder that I don't believe he committed, and he took, an incredible journey. He starts where you talk, where you were just talking about. I mean, he does not come from a poor family. This is not the South Bronx. This is the North Bronx, where there's, people have jobs, nice neighborhood. There are lawns, and cars, and Cal, he wants more stuff. I mean, he sees people walking around, and who is it that has the stuff he wants? Well, they're drug dealers. So naturally, you're going to look up to people, and yet, what I find amazing about Cal is, having been with him for the last 7 years, and I say been with him, let me not exaggerate that. I'm a guy living on the outside in Brooklyn, New York. It's not like I took this journey with him, but I talk to him fairly frequently, and I think I understand to some extent what was going through his mind at certain points. But what's incredible about Cal is that he, in prison, became this person who could lead a campaign for his freedom from a prison payphone. I mean, the way he had the whole system stacked against him. They threw him in prison, and he was framed by a guy who idolized him, who dealt drugs with him. The cops won him off the streets. Their interests are joined. One uses the other. Cal goes to prison, and at some point he buckles down. He develops patience, incredible discipline. I mean, Cal was a guy who refused to go out of the jail cell because he stayed in and he focused on his case. He focused on also creating businesses. I mean, he had been a very successful crack distributor, and he knew how to run a business, and he was determined when he came out that he would be a businessman, this time legitimate, because he knew he had developed these skills and he knew he had these gifts. And there's somehow Cal held on to that belief in himself, in his innocence, for 22 years that he was doing. I mean, through all kinds of hopelessness. I mean, I'll give you one example, and in my podcast, Empire on Blood, I think there's a kind of an amazing scene where someone else confesses to the murders. Cal wins an appeal, but the cops and the prosecutor don't believe this guy's confession, and they go in and pressure him and get him to recant his confession. This is 10 years ago. So it takes another 10 years of facing incredible disappointment and overcoming it to really alone, never giving up, to finally stare down the government and get the evidence that finally sets him free.
So let me ask you this. Did he have a support system on the outside, that was helping him? Because, we are aware of many different wrongfully convicted people, political prisoners like Mumia Abu-Jamal, Herman Bell, who's there in New York, and you got the police union trying to reverse the parole board's decision. So did Calvin have a support system?
Calvin did have a support system, but it was an informal group of friends, and I'll say Calvin is a fairly charming man, and so he had several women who would help him from time to time, and Cal was somebody who could inspire people to help him. He couldn't do it alone because, as we all know, a prisoner, one of the key things about prison is you're isolated. The only tool you have, the only contact that you have is, you can have visitors and you can use the payphone. And aside from that, you're powerless. So, Cal really needed somebody on the outside. I think to some extent, he was hoping for someone like me who could come along and try to tell his story to people who might be in a position of influence. But, he also was able to enlist friends and supporters and people that he knew to do, and this was a crucial thing. Cal was always convinced that there had to be people at the scene of the crime who saw the person who really did it. And the cops had never found anybody. They'd done a kind of cursory examination of it, and guess what? People didn't want to speak up to the cops. They didn't want to speak up at a time when there were murders going on. But Cal was convinced that if somebody would go back and canvass that area, a witness could be found. So he asked his people to put up posters at the scene of the crime. And this is 15, 20 years later. And those posters had a picture of him. It had the words "Free Calvin Buari, wrongfully convicted," and it had a phone number. 20 years after his conviction, a woman who had lived in the apartment building right next to the scene of the crime and then moved out of state, moved to North Carolina, she came home on a family reunion. She sees that poster that's been put up, and she says, "Oh, my God, I know Calvin didn't do this." And that's what gets the ball rolling. So it's the flukiest of flukes, but it also has to do with Cal's persistence, his ability to rally people on the outside to help him. And I really think, in so many of these cases, it's testimony to a kind of human will, a willpower. And, it's hard not to see the grace of God that smiles on you at some point. And then, as you point out, those few people, those volunteers, those people who can be mobilized to help you when you most need it. And who can count on all those things coming together at once?
A common theme, before I toss it to Max to see if he has any questions, we're having a little technical issues with his line, but we're working through those. But one of the common themes that we see in these wrongful convictions, because we do a segment called the Underground Railroad of these people who have been exonerated after wrongful convictions, is just prosecutorial misconduct is a common theme in these cases. And then also it seems to be, you speak about willpower, but a seemingly lack of willpower on the behalf of the police to get the right person who did it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you see that in this case. You know, the cops and the prosecutor, all right, you know, it's Mayor Giuliani. He wants to clean up the streets. And, you know, it's true that the black neighborhoods probably are the biggest victims of crimes of violence and crimes involving drugs. And lots of people really want the streets cleaned up. But at the same time, the prosecutor's job is to seek justice, not conviction. And I think in their haste to accomplish what they felt was important, they felt that lots of things were justified. Now, one of the incredible things that I discovered and comes out in Empire on Blood, and this will not be a surprise to a lot of your listeners, but to me the extent of it was surprising, is you had in this case cooperators as witnesses. So you had, I think it was 4 cooperators, people who had been associates of Calvin. Suddenly they come forward and they say, wait, I saw who the murderer was. It was Calvin Buari. But what's the background to that? You have the prosecutor able to put these people in jail or say to them, listen, you help us and no jail time. And it's an easy choice for a lot of people to make. In fact, there's one guy who actually is in prison who comes out of prison to testify, and the prosecutor helps that person get out of prison early. So it is an incredible tool, an incredible weapon that the state is given to do what they decide is the right thing to do. You know, if you're a defense attorney, if you're a defendant, you give $50 to a witness to take a taxi cab to the courtroom to testify. That's illegal. But you give somebody a get-out-of-jail-free card to testify, that's called justice. Now, the second thing that happens in Calvin's case, and I read the transcripts, and I think this is really what converted me to his case and his cause, is the prosecutor goes to the judge and says, Your Honor, Calvin Buari is so dangerous that my witnesses fear for their lives. I need an order of protection. The judge says, okay, you've got your order of protection. Now, that means that the defense, the attorney and Calvin, do not know the names of the witnesses who are going to testify against him until they walk to the witness stand.
Wow.
If you can imagine trying to prepare your defense,
you can't,
without knowing exactly who the witnesses are going to be. I mean, you know, now those are legal. That's legal. That's the system playing ball the way the system says it can play ball. But there was another thing that happened in this situation that I really feel goes beyond and much more towards what the point you brought up a little while ago about the kind of misconduct that we unfortunately see too often. There is the prosecution's chief witness against Calvin is his former drug partner. Now, that drug partner, his name is Dwight, and I have become friends with Dwight. Dwight is actually now in prison for a different murder, and he and I have fairly frequent conversations. And Dwight has opened up to me about a lot of stuff that happened during Cal's trial. And at one point he tells me that he lied on the stand, that he committed perjury under oath. And I asked him, I said, well, did the prosecutor know this? And he said, well, it was common knowledge. And so I said to him, well, were you surprised that the prosecutor didn't say anything about you lying on the stand? And Dwight, who he has deep insights into how the system works, he says, no, I wasn't surprised that they let me lie. That's how the system works. Anybody who plays by the rules is going to lose. You know, and when I heard a guy who's involved with, who is probably chiefly responsible for framing Calvin Buari, admit that he lied on the stand and say that he lied on the stand probably with the full knowledge of the prosecution, I mean, that to me is very chilling. And you know, one of the things I'm proud about with Empire on Blood is that, you know, we're able to get at these individual acts by characters, by real people that change the course of the history of the people involved. But we're also able to take a close look at the system, how it enables and profits from exactly these kinds of interactions.
We are speaking with Steve Fishman. He has a podcast which you can find on iTunes, Empire on Blood. I want to toss it to Max to see if Max has any questions for you, Mr. Fishman. Max, you there?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me clear enough?
I can, Max. Go ahead.
Hello? I can. Oh, okay, great. I put up the links on New Abolitionist Radio to your podcast, as well as the story about the brother who you were working with towards his freedom. So if you want to check those links, just go to New Abolitionist Radio on Facebook, and you can find it there. We'll also put it on our BTR community page. So I was listening to you talk, and I did have one disagreement, and I had a couple of comments that I want to make about a few things. One is, you were saying the story that you're telling right here about this brother who went through all of this really is much more common than you might expect. And we are witnesses to that in particular because, as Scotty said, every week we read one of these brothers' stories or sisters' stories or young kids' stories every week. And we've been doing it for quite some time now. So we are really very aware that this is not an isolated incident. This is something that is happening everywhere in every state, in every city across America, particularly to young black males. And it hasn't ended since it began, or allegedly began, back in the 90s or the 70s. It's still going on in the same way. And the process these brothers go through is almost like a script now, because they're all doing the same exact thing. They run their campaigns from the prison phone, and their charisma and their ability to get people involved and invested in their story is something that is integral. It's extremely important, because without their voices, you really won't be heard. And if you're blessed to get somebody like you, Brother Fisher, who really tells the story in detail, that makes it even much better. Because, you know, there are people like Mumia and Peltzer and Ricky Kidd who are international names that people know about, who are fighting for their freedom. So it is very, very much commonplace. It's wonderful when somebody like yourself grabs a hold of one of these stories and puts it out into the atmosphere so the world can see these tragedies and the type of corruption involved and the casualness of how you deal with people's lives, like they don't really matter. The one thing that I did disagree with you, Mr. Fisher, on is when you said earlier on that this really is mass incarceration. Here at New Abolitionist Radio, we really don't see it like that at all. If it were truly mass incarceration, it would be 4 million white men in prison, because they're all things considered being equal. 74% of the population, there would be 4 million white men in prison, and that's not the case at all. We call it modern-day slavery and human trafficking, which is allowed through the 13th Amendment and is functioning throughout our entire justice system, which follows market values. And when they put these young men and women in these prisons and jails, they charge this taxpayer as much as $350,000 a year just to house them for 1 year. And that's in New York, where you're talking about. It was going on particularly badly in Rikers Island, where the cost to house an inmate like Khalif Browder is $165,000 a year. There's a profit margin involved here. And they don't mind letting a lot of things slide, including constitutional violations, as long as there's a body in a cell for as long as it can possibly be there.
I mean, we see how all of these industries are connected to this prison system, where you have huge industries, $1 billion industries built around simple things like providing slippers or potato chips or, ramen noodles. It's crazy.
I hear you. And, I think you see this in the most dramatic way in the privatization of the prison system. It's big business. And, like any business, it's run, you cut costs and your margin of profit goes up. So what's the motivation to do right by anybody? I mean, what's the motivation to provide programs or enrichment or, any distraction? It's just not there. You are right that it is a market-based economy. And I do think that in the private side, and it is big business, the private side of prisons, you just see this in a extremely dramatic and frightening way. And to your other point, I do focus on Calvin Buari, but because of my involvement in this, I have come into contact with, and in some cases become friends with, other people, other black men who have been in this situation. So you're absolutely right. It's all too common. One of the people who was a great influence on me in getting into this podcast is a guy he's part of Empire on Blood, part of the podcast. His name is Emil McDowell, and he was a 17-year-old honor student in Brooklyn when he was picked out of a crowd and convicted of a murder, which it took him 19 years to convince a court he was not guilty of. And, the reason that I mention him is because he is an extremely bright, like Calvin Buari, he's an extremely bright man who taught himself the law. I mean, a lot of people talk about jailhouse lawyers, but Emil really was a top-flight jailhouse lawyer who takes Calvin under his wing and helps him with his case. And then Emil writes the appeal that gets him out of prison after 19 years. And then Calvin follows that up by reaching out to Emil once Emil's out, and Emil helps him with his legal problems because Emil has actually gone to work for a criminal defense firm now, and he is helping people who were in his position. Emil, is one of the really kind of unsung heroes of this podcast, but in my research and my journey, I met all too many people who were put in the position of having to fight the system on a constant basis and fight it in isolation and teach themselves the law and beg attorneys to help them out for no money. And it is a tragedy that this continues to go on.
We're friends, close friends with many members of the Jailhouse Lawyers Guild. They have their own guild now, and there's a lot of brothers and sisters that had to become jailhouse lawyers in order to fight their case. An example would be a young brother I know, who Darrell Paget, who was arrested with less than a gram of cocaine, and they gave him 37 and a half years for less than a gram of cocaine. So he became a jailhouse lawyer and got himself out in 20 years. And he even inspired President Obama at the time, who wrote him a letter. So it's part of the process that they have to go through to learn these things if you want any hope of being out ever. Because the number of people who are locked behind bars who are innocent or the crime doesn't fit the time is just amazing. Today's person who we are highlighting for our rider of the 21st Century Underground Railroad is getting out, who just got out last week after 45 years. 45 years.
Wow.
It's crazy. It's crazy out there. We see a lot of constitutional crises happen. For instance, people talk about this cash bail, which keeps people in. And, 90% of people 95% of people who are in there are people of color who can't afford to pay those bails. But that's not something you can reform. That's a violation of the 8th Amendment, which guarantees you protection from cruel and unusual punishment and excessive bails and fees. And that's happening every day. That's a constitutional crisis. And as a person who is familiar with law and the Constitution, would you agree with me?
I would agree with you. And I think to Max's point as well, it's part of the market economy. I mean, bail bondsmen are making a ton of money. And, what are you going to do? You're going to say, no, I'm not going to pay the money to get my loved one out of prison? I mean, talk about a crisis moment. You really don't have a choice. You're really going to pay whatever it takes to get that loved one out of prison. So, this is it's a constitutional crisis, and it's just made so much worse by the profit motive that people latch on to, that people subscribe to, and in exchange for what? A conscience. Hello? Max, are you there? I've lost you.
I'm sorry that I had myself muted. I didn't have my mixer right. The question I would like to ask you is, how did you go from talking about financial crimes of Bernie Madoff to Calvin Buari's story and then Empire on Blood? What piqued your interest and why are you so involved now?
Well, the gentleman I just mentioned, Emil, was a guy, he'd been convicted of murder and then wrote the appeal that got him out. And he and I became friends around his case. He'd written to me from prison. I'd been involved for some time. And then when he got out, he and I had a friendship, really. And one day he says to me, here's a file of Calvin Buari. I think he's innocent. And Emil's opinion meant a lot to me. It just did. He was a guy who I think is credible and trustworthy and smart. And I said, okay, well, I'll talk to Cal. And Cal calls me on the phone, and I'm sure you've all gotten phone calls like this. You hear somebody, and you hear that despair in their voice, and you also hear that despair that they're trying to muffle and keep contained because, they're trying to shout, I need help, but they know if they're shouting, then people are going to run away. So there's this moment when I kind of hear this despair in Cal's voice, and I start to think, and again, let me emphasize, my life could not be more different than Cal's, but I do imagine what it's like to have an entire criminal justice system stacked against you, and there you are at a prison payphone trying to rattle off in 30 seconds the evidence of your innocence. It's an impossible situation for any person to be in, and I'm gripped by that moment, really, and in some ways it kind of changed a lot of my life and set me on this journey. And what I say to Cal is, Cal, I'll take the next step. Send me the transcripts of your trial. And I mentioned the kinds of things I saw in those transcripts about people being given get out of jail free cards and witnesses with their identities being held secret. But I think for me, when I was reading those transcripts, the thing that also really struck me is the reaction of the judge. The judge, in a transcript, it's what happens in court, but they also transcribe what happens in the judge's chambers between the two lawyers and the judge out of earshot of the jury. So I had a fuller view of what was going on in the mind of a judge who was seeing it all. And at one point he says, for all I know, there's a call out to every drug dealer in the northeast part of the United States. Come testify and you'll get a jail out of free card. And, this is the judge. He's saying this out loud. And for me, it was reading stuff like that. It was imagining Cal being at the other end of that and thinking, I can't not get involved. I can't not take another step if I can help.
Well, again, actually, you didn't have to, because there's a lot of people who take the opposite approach and say, it's not my problem. Okay, so, that says something about your character. But we do have a caller from the New York area. I do believe this is Brother Thomas, area code 347. Thank you for calling in the New Abolitionist Radio. We're speaking with Steve Fishman, and he has a podcast about what we've been speaking on called Empire on Blood, which you can find on iTunes. Did you have a question or a comment for Mr. Fishman?
Good evening, Scotty. Good evening to the guest and to Max as well. I didn't. I had a question for Max. However, what the guest is talking about is heartfelt story. Did you say, Max, that it's $355,000 a year to house a prisoner in New York State?
For a teenager, yes, and for an adult in Rikers Island, it's over 106. Yes, for like Khalif Browder, he was $360,000 a year nearly. That's how much he was making for the 3 years that he was there. They were making $360,000. For an adult in the same facilities, it's over $160,000.
Yes, I think New York has the highest per incarceration cost in the nation for juveniles.
Yeah, and they got them
Florida has the least.
In the worst conditions.
For $360,000, you should be living in a mansion.
Yeah, I know. And then I'm seeing the documentary they just put out where the kids have this gang and they have to follow the program and all this stuff. And I mean, and the CEO is just like letting it happen. Unbelievable. I'll mute my line. That was my question, because that when I heard that, it just like it stunned me. Like, oh my God.
Thank you.
Enjoyed the show, and commend the work you and Scotty do, Max, and the gentleman that's also speaking. Thank you.
Thank you for your call. We have another caller, and also from the NYC area. I believe this is Brother Ross, or it may be Brother Tag. I'm not sure which. 646, thank you for calling in to New Abolitionist Radio. We're on tonight with Mr. Steve Fishman, who is the producer of the podcast Empire on Blood. Go ahead with your question and comment.
Yes, peace, Steve Fishman. Peace to you, Brother Scotty, and to Brother Max, and everyone else that's keeping out New Abolitionist Radio. This is Tag.
What's on your mind tonight, Tag?
Well, quite a bit right now, matter of fact. But, while the guest is on the line, I did have some questions for him. So, Steve Fishman, I was just wondering, based on your extensive research into this case, just off top, like, what would you say is the frequency of these kinds of wrongful convictions, these kinds of frame-ups in New York? From what you could tell, and perhaps you've spoken to other heads who were inside as you were conducting your research, does this seem to be common to you? What seems to be the frequency of these kinds of frame-ups?
Well, the statistics are obviously hard to come by. I think to Scotty and Max's point, it does seem like we read about them every week, or even sometimes more frequently. And I follow the Innocence Project, and it seems like sometimes there's 2 a week. It's very difficult to come by numbers of people that are in prison unjustly, though I've heard estimates from people connected with the Innocence Project that it could be as many as 100,000 inmates. It could be as many as 100,000 people who are wrongfully convicted. Certainly there have been some number whose cases have come to light, and there was this kind of magnificent moment when DNA testing arrived, and suddenly you could find out that hey, guess what? He wasn't at the scene of the crime. That wasn't his blood. And that really suddenly, I think, exploded the idea that cops have the answers. I think that that's one of the things that for a mass population has really been somewhat of a positive experience, is that we, and I mean the general public now, I believe, accepts the fact that the Justice Department is not always just. And so the prejudice in favor of the government that on an individual basis in the court, I think to some extent that's been diminished. I mean, we unfortunately see lots of tragic cases, and maybe the biggest tragedy is that we're not surprised by them anymore. So I think numbers are hard to come by, but if there's even one person, then it's one too many.
I would like to interject, excuse me, Steve, that Tag is actually an intern for our nonprofit media organization here in North Carolina, but he is our NYC representative. Been working with us since he came in contact with Black Talk Radio and wrote a college paper about our network. But he's more importantly a abolitionist in the New York area, and I'm just putting that out there in case y'all want to connect up and work on some projects together. But Tag, you said you had some other questions.
Yes, and I'm much appreciated on that, Brother Scotty, because that segues directly into another question that I had, which is more important than some of the other questions that I would like to address if there's time. But are you aware, Steve Fishman, of the events, the murder? From what I can tell, it's unclear as yet because it seems the information is being heavily suppressed as usual. But are you at all aware of this shooting death of this brother in Crown Heights at the hands of the NYPD slave catchers this afternoon?
Oh, no, I haven't heard about that. Do you have details on that this afternoon?
Yes, the details are very slow to be released. It is, in fact, last I checked, not even posted as yet on killedbypolice.net, but the general details seem to be that this brother was known to be on this block outside of this particular fruit stand on the regular, had some sort of issues, whether physical or mental. It's unclear as yet, but based on testimony provided by a relative of his, a young sister, he was, having difficulties, has had long-term difficulties, but never, was known to bother anyone, and was shot at least 7, possibly 10 rounds were shot at him, and he died at Kings County Hospital out in Crown Heights, and it appears that there are still many heads there at the scene trying to discern what exactly happened. It also seems that the majority of the slave catchers who were there when this occurred were DTs, were plainclothes, and only 2 of them were uniformed, and it doesn't seem that they actually presented who they were, identified themselves before proceeding to shoot and kill him. And they're alleging that he was holding a metal pipe in a fashion that was threatening to them, in a 2-handed stance. Those are the general details from what I can tell thus far.
I'm seeing it online now, in the Daily News as an article. NYPD cops shoot, kill mentally ill black man holding metal pipe. That's what the headline is in the Daily News. I guess we'll find out more about this as we go on.
Tag, also, because you are there and you've been very involved in the Bronx 120 case. Would you like to ask Mr. Fishman about anything concerning, this tactic in New York of using RICO charges because when we talk about people being murdered, but when you have someone who has been convicted of murder, sentenced, does the time, and then people, just because of so-called gang affiliation, are then later swept up, which is what is represented in the Bronx 120 case. Tag, if you could lay that out for us, I would like to know what Mr. Fishman thinks about that.
Absolutely. I appreciate your presenting that, because, in fact, we're coming up against the 2-year commemoration of the April 27th raiding of our community, particularly in this instance, the Eastchester Gardens community primarily, but others as well, which I would imagine you heard about, Steve Fishman, this terroristic large-scale shock and awe raid that descended on the Eastchester Garden community under dead of night, April 27th of 2016. Do you recall that raid?
I don't, Tag, but go ahead, fill me in.
So essentially, under extremely flimsy, quote-unquote, evidence, RICO charges were leveled against primarily dark-skinned, non-white youths, primarily, and the RICO charges were behind essentially, alleged association, as Brother Scotty mentioned, this question of so-called gang affiliation. So being purported to be a part of street families, and under the aegis of being a part of street families, this group of the 120 individuals were all put up on federal charges. And this has been an ongoing problem with that particular case of the 120 individuals who have, of course, run the gamut of all sorts of, terrorism that's befallen themselves and their families off of being, held in federal detention centers. Some now are imprisoned. Many, in fact, are now imprisoned at this point. Some have, since been released. But furthermore, you may be familiar with the permanent exclusion rules or policy of NYCHA, which allows NYCHA to essentially threaten eviction to family members of those who have been arrested, simply arrested, not necessarily actually convicted of anything. But through this ruling, many heads that were taken in, that were encaged and put into, prison slavery in some form or another behind this raid, alleging association, many of these associations, of course, being completely bogus. And I'm sure you're familiar with these kinds of tactics, given the research that you've been doing, particularly in the Bronx, but under extremely flimsy so-called evidence, mainly drawn from social media interactions and, allegations around, things as seemingly frivolous as music videos or social media activity. These 120 individuals are facing or have faced many of them now suffering under the fact that they were charged with these federal charges, which in fact, and it's been covered on this network, thankfully, in depth, which in fact has allowed for many of them to face what is usually termed double jeopardy, because under these federal charges, heads who have done time or been charged already with a so-called crime can be sent up for that same, infraction, and in fact have in many instances.
Well, that's an amazing story. I'm familiar with parts of that. And in particular, I've run into the situation where the the New York Housing Authority will ban entire families from the premises, basically evict them because one family member is accused of a crime. So suddenly you have these repercussions throughout a whole system based on an arrest which, Tag, as you say, may be based on the flimsiest of circumstances. It's kind of incredible.
And without a conviction.
Without conviction. And it is incredible the effects that this can have throughout an entire community.
Well, Mr. Fishman, Tag, unless you had something else, because we're running a little over. But of course, we can make time for you. But if you have some other questions, if you would like to get those out so that we can conclude our segment with Mr. Fishman.
Well, I would like to perhaps revisit this question of the murder, or it seems to me a murder that occurred this afternoon, as well as related issues around these so-called gang raids. I'm happy to mute my line and hold off until y'all conclude the interview. The only other thing off top that I did want to raise to Steve Fishman, particularly because I seen it mentioned on your social media page, a retweet around this question. There was a lot of attention about this New York Times article that dropped somewhat recently, highlighting what's termed so-called test-lying on the part of the NYPD and other slave catchers. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on this phenomenon of so-called test-lying, because from my perspective, usually that's just termed perjury, right?
Yeah, and nobody ever gets charged with perjury. It turns out, cops, Listen, I don't think everybody gets up there in lines, but it's all too common, and stories get shaded, and stories are meant to conform to the prevailing view, to the most useful view to the prosecution. And I don't think, sadly, any of us are surprised by that. But what I ran into, and one of the things, and it's a related thing, when I was again reading this transcript of Cal Buari's 1995 trial, and again, that's in Empire on Blood, the podcast. One of the things that continually happens is that a detective takes the stand, and the defense attorney says, "Well, you interviewed this witness or this witness. Well, can you show us your notes?" And the detective says, "Oh, I didn't take any notes." And you're left stunned. I mean, it's got to be one of two things. It's either he's lying and the notes are somewhere, or he's been instructed not to take notes so that the defense would not be able to discover what the witness actually said to the cops. I mean, either way, it kind of feels like another way of rigging the system. Now, I understand there are bad guys. There are people who should be in prison. There's no doubt. I think we can stipulate to that. But the system can't be rigged in favor of conviction. It's got to be set out to pursue justice. And one of the things, and the last thing, and then I'll leave you, and thank you for having me, is the prosecutor in Calvin Buari's case was a guy who I think the facts show and the podcast shows at some point really sought conviction over justice. And that's a heavy charge to level at one individual who will tell you that he served his state and the public. But what I discovered is that, in fact, he had previously been admonished by a federal court judge for exactly that same thing. It was about 5 years before the conviction of Calvin Buari a federal judge named Denny Chin had released 2 men convicted of murder in the Bronx and said basically, I cannot believe that the district attorney did not more thoroughly investigate this case and did not come to the conclusion that these men were innocent. And I am taking the extraordinary measure of releasing them today. And he goes on to really dress down and scold the district attorney, saying, your job is not to seek convictions. Your job is to seek justice. And the prosecutor in that case was the same prosecutor that prosecuted Calvin Buari 5 years later. And the one note I'll add to that is it did not affect his career at all. He could be dressed down, he could be accused, he could be convicted, so to speak, of having really done a bad deed. And still, at the end of the year, he got his raise. And I think that one of the things we're finding out, and testifying certainly speaks to that point, is that within the criminal justice system, it is very difficult to hold people, whether they're detectives or prosecutors or anybody else, it's very difficult to hold them accountable.
And that only breeds more misconduct when you know there's likely not to be any repercussions.
Yes.
I think you're right. I was just going to thank you for having me tonight.
If I may, before we let you go, if I may say a couple things. The first thing is for the first caller that called in earlier asking about the cost of incarcerating youth, there's a video we created for New Abolitionist Radio called The Cost of Living, and it gives you the exact number of every state, 47 states that we could find the information on, along with a video that goes along with it, spoken word video. So you can check that out there. We were talking earlier about the RICO charges being used against the gang members out in New York. Well, the same thing is happening out in Mississippi right now. And they found out that every single person that was being arrested under these drug charges were black people from 2010 to 2017.
You mean gang charges, gang affiliation
We're talking
charges.
about 97,000 people, 97,000 black people in one state that were arrested under these RICO charges. So this is happening in other places as well. And I want to quantify some of the questions that came up about how many people are wrongfully incarcerated. There's a study that stated that in 17% of the cases, jury cases, the jury is wrong. 17%, that's a big number. And then another study came out and said 40% of those prisoners that we have now housed shouldn't even be there. There's no reason for them to be in prisons. So when you add those two up, you're talking about nearly 1.5 million people who are incarcerated that should not be. That's amazing.
That is amazing.
I'd like to, again, thank you for coming and sharing this story with us. If you want to check out his podcast, it's Empire on Blood, the newest true crime podcast to binge on. And one of our listeners did binge on it. Shout out to Otis, who said he watched all 7 of them already. So I look forward to watching them as well. I want to ask you to do us a favor, though. You're an investigative journalist. Look into the 13th Amendment and look at the connection it has to the largest prison population in the history of humanity on planet Earth. You will be surprised at what you find.
I will do that.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Me.
Well, Mr. Fishman,
have a great day.
If anyone would like to contact you, how would they get in touch with you? And to the other callers, I'm sorry, we got to end the segment. We are overdue for our break. And when we come back on the other side, we can take your calls if you want to add some commentary. But Mr. Fishman, you got any final words for our listeners and how they can, again, they, of course, can access your podcast, Empire on Blood, on iTunes. But is there anything else you would like to leave with them?
Well, I guess I would just like to leave. Thank you again, and hope that the podcast, hope that it entertains you, hope that it moves you, and hope that it maybe helps you decide that there's things that you can get involved in to make sure wrongful convictions don't happen. I think, everybody has a role to play, and I hope one of the things from Empire on Blood, I hope one of the things is that it alerts you to the ways in which things can go wrong and the specifics of them. And I think that there's a role that we can all play, whether it's at the ballot box or, as TAG is doing, helping make videos and make people aware. But I do think that this is a situation that needs to be addressed forcefully. And again, I want to thank you. And Otis, please write a review on iTunes about your experience of listening to Empire on Blood. I do really appreciate it. To all those people who have listened and written comments, it's been the #1 podcast in the country for a few days now, and that's incredibly gratifying to me. And by the way, to Calvin Buari, who may be listening in. But thanks again, guys. I'll let you go.
All right, Mr. Fishman. Yes, you have a good evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
Amazing, man. And, I don't think he mentioned it about Calvin Buari, but he's actually running his own business from what I read on the article now, where he's transporting visitors, family members, back and forth to the prisons. So in the article, it was saying he shows up at the prison with his business card, giving it to the prison guards.
Well, Max, you want to take us to break, and I guess when we come back, we could share a couple of news headlines before we get into our regular segments, if we don't have any callers.
Yes, indeed. You're listening to New Abolitionist Radio right here on the Black Talk Radio Network. You just heard from Steve Fishman, who is the author of Empire on Blood, the #1 podcast in the country right now. We'll be right back after these messages.
Hi, the Black Talk Media Project would like to invite you to become a member of the BTR Community subscription-based social media platform. BTR Community is a platform that was set up for the listening audience of Black Talk Radio Network, the #1 independent black radio network online. For just $24 per year, your subscription gives you access to an interactive space to share information with like-minded people with your privacy guaranteed. Your subscription will go a long way to help us maintain and improve our current media platforms. It will also help provide a budget so that we can begin the task of establishing localized media centers and radio stations across the United States. The best way to show your support and appreciation for what we do here at Black Talk Radio is to subscribe. Help us to help you be informed. Join btrcommunity.com today.
You are tuned in to the Black Talk Radio Network. For podcasts and live program scheduling, visit us on the web at blacktalkradionetwork.com.
Peace and welcome back to New Abolitionist Radio. If you want to have a question or a comment and you want to join the conversation, feel free to join in and with the conversation we're having here on New Abolitionist Radio. If you're already on the uberconference.com site, just press ** to unmute yourself. And if you want to call in, it's 704-802-5026.
And we do have a caller, area code 816 out of the Missouri, state of Missouri. Do you have a question or comment for us? Thank you for calling in to New Abolitionist Radio tonight.
Yes, this is Jeff Humfeld up in Kansas City.
Hi, Jeff.
How are you doing tonight, Max? And
tired, but I'm good.
I hope your wife is doing well. I wanted to call in and talk just a little bit. You mentioned Ricky Kidd, and there has been development in his particular situation. Unfortunately, it has not been a particularly good development. I think I had mentioned maybe a little while back that I went down to the Supreme Court hearing for Ricky. They were trying to have his appeal heard here in Kansas City in Jackson County, and that was taken, the state of Missouri objected to that and wanted it heard up in DeKalb County the state won their thing, so that means Ricky's got to start all over on this and go back to court in DeKalb County now, so it'd be at least another year before he's in court again to try and have this heard. He did put something up on his Facebook page yesterday, and I'd like to read that if I could real quick.
Yes, please.
Today,
as you know, we are his publisher. We published his book.
I know you are. Today, the Missouri Supreme Court ruled against my ability to have my case heard in Jackson County. Often I'm left with no choice but to dream of winning my deserved freedom. But sometimes reality and dreams are the farthest apart. The best lawyers in the world, the most compelling facts of innocence you can find, a slew of influential and important local leaders standing behind you, a group of extraordinary supporters like you all. How do we continue to not see the favorable ruling? When will it ever show itself? It's like falling and never reaching the bottom, or staring into a black hole. Somehow I'm expected to continue in strength and stride. I'll keep you posted on how that is going. Pray for me. I was really lucky because last week I went down to visit Ricky at the Jackson County Jail, and because they're so understaffed and out of, just totally inept, we were 20 minutes late getting to start our visit, but they forgot to come get him, and I ended up visiting with Ricky for 2 hours. And I'm so glad now that I was able to spend that time with him, and we talked about a lot of things, especially about what he would do when he got out and things of that sort. But what I would like to say is, he needs your thoughts and prayers for sure right now. And if you're on Facebook, go to Justice for Ricky Kidd and just leave your comments and your show of support for him there. It will get to him, and I think that will really help him at this time. So
yes,
that's basically what I wanted to let folks know is go to Justice for Ricky Kidd on Facebook and leave your thoughts and let him know that there's a lot of us out here in support of him and his case.
Pick up his book, too. It helps to help him to continue this fight. So go to his website and pick up his book. It's a wonderful book published by Prismatic Dreams. And for the 6 months that we were working on his book together here, he would call up almost every day at some points, and we had so many conversations. For those that don't know, Ricky Kidd was incarcerated in 1996, falsely incarcerated, crimes he did not commit. The mayor says he didn't commit it. The prosecutor says he didn't commit it. Even the arresting officers and police chief are like, he didn't commit it. But for some reason, he's still in prison. And the Midwest Innocence Project has been trying to help to get him out. So as Jeff just said, that wasn't good news. It means he's starting all over from scratch, and it's heartbreaking. So our hearts go out to you, Ricky, and to your family who is going through this with you.
Max, what's the website where they can pick up the book?
FreeRickyKid.com.
FreeRickyKid.com. And Kid, is that with 2 D's or 1?
That's with 2 D's.
Okay.
2 D's, indeed. We try to do whatever we can to help them in these times. And even if it's just praying, that collective positive thought maybe sometimes makes a difference.
And Jeff,
thank you, Jeff, for calling.
Yeah, I want to thank you for the work and your involvement on these very, very important issues, which I feel like there's nothing more important than confronting this system of slavery that has impacted so many so negatively. So thank you for the work and your involvement in this case.
Well, thank you for what you guys are doing as well. And we'll be talking with you again one of these days, I'm sure.
Indeed, brother. I'll probably see you soon, too. Because they're talking about the Missouri Cure Conference happening again, and maybe we'll be able to come out there once again.
We have another caller, 646. Thank you for calling in the New Abolitionist Radio. I believe this is Tag again. Tag?
Yes, peace. Pardon for just jumping back on the line so quickly, but appreciate your picking back up. Well, so before I discuss what I was looking to discuss, which essentially has to do with the Bronx 120, which we were discussing before, and this issue of so-called gang raids, I just wanted to check in and make sure, Brother Max, did you get the posts? Did you see the posts that were put up that you had requested? I just wanted to make sure that you knew.
No, actually, I didn't see them, but I went out and found them. So I had planned to talk about it today, but I don't think we're going to have time to really go into the detail of everything that's happening there. So I might have to hold it off till next week. But I did find that letter that actually was talking to the cadets and telling them what they shouldn't pay attention to. Is that the one you were telling me about?
Yes, exactly. It was that, and you had also asked that I post the interview, which was part one of interviewing around inside-outside organizing with a comrade who has recently come home. So I put those into BTR community. I'm not sure if you meant for me to put them elsewhere.
Yeah, I'll go check it out there. But I just posted the one where that we were just talking about a moment ago, where pull up this headline for it here. It's on New Abolitionist Radio. You can find it there. And it's in response to Larry Krasner and what he's doing in Philadelphia. And apparently the FOP president is criticizing those comments and talking to the Academy cadets, telling them what they should and shouldn't do, and right in the face of Krasner's memo of what he plans on doing to stop mass incarceration.
Right.
Thanks, Tad.
Right. Oh, absolutely. No question, anytime. And, so I just wanted to clear that up in case you hadn't seen it, because I didn't see a reply to it, and it occurred to me that maybe you were looking for it, elsewhere. So just wanted to.
Yes, I will get that one indeed.
No doubt. And, as we know, this is a long-standing issue with these slave catchers going rogue, so to speak, and feeling as though the authority that they're allotted extends past those who write their marching orders. So it shouldn't be surprising, but I just wanted to kind of go back to this question of the 2-year commemoration of the Bronx 120 raids, and just to point out and to update for everyone who may have heard the interview with heads involved in IWOC, putting together a welcome home event, just to update that it looks at present as though that event is now going to take place on the 27th of April, this month, April 27th, to be a part of a dual event that speaks to the commemoration of the April 27th terroristic, quote unquote, gang raid that occurred with respect to the Bronx 120, as well as a celebration of our comrades who have come home, those who we will be highlighting and celebrating specifically at that event, as well as any and all others who perhaps are not looking to, be identified specifically or by name, but any and all of those who are back home out here. That event will be taking place now on the 27th, in conjunction with other looks to not only celebrate the fact of those who have withstood that terrorism, those terroristic shock and awe tactics, but also to condemn those who enacted that kind of terrorism on our communities. So that'll be on the 27th of this month in the Bronx, and more information certainly will be forthcoming, and y'all will be the first ones, to get updated information, so that I have any updates on that I get.
Awesome. Thank you, Tag.
All right, so let's move on to our regular segments. We're just going to skip that last break. I do want to thank all the callers for calling in and expressing their point of views and their questions for our guests. And of course, we want to thank Mr. Fishman for taking the time out to spend with us and share his thoughts on these issues, as well as his podcast, Empire on Blood. So, Max, is there a couple of headlines you wanted to share that really stood out that you wanted to get out?
Yes, sir, there is. And as a matter of fact, what we can do is there's two particular stories that I just want to cover briefly out of all of them that we have. And while I'm doing that, if you could do the honor of pulling out the Abolitionist in Profile. And
already got it up, brother.
Great. It's his speech, and we can read his speech to the world. The first thing I want to tell you about is what we said in the intro and earlier in the program regarding Mississippi's crime unit. It's called the Mississippi State Gang Assessment, also known as MAGI, which is some really arrogant stuff. Oh, you're a magician, huh? A wizard. But apparently they told the Clarion out there that 53% of the gang members they were arresting were white. So they're looking into this, trying to find out, where they get this number from. And apparently they pulled it out their ass, because the truth of the matter is the administrative office of the courts confirmed that from fiscal year 2010 through 2017, court disposition data showed that 97 people were processed under current gang law. All of them were black. Of those, 97,022 pled guilty. 4 were dismissed. 1 faced house arrest. 11 were no bill dismissed. 1 was non-adjudicated. 53 reprimanded, passed to the file, and 5 had probation revoked. The administration office of the courts confirmed from 2010 to 14, it was seldom used, fewer than 30 disposition. DeGry explained in an email, the last 2 years of data indicates 32 indictments disposed of per year. These came from 5 of the 22 districts, but primarily from Forest and DeSoto counties. So apparently, all they're arresting under these gang laws is black people. And the other thing I wanted to point out to you that there's a
wait a minute, Max. No neo-Nazis, no, Anglo terrorists, because they got gangs too.
Nope. And they were talking about white gang members when they put the damn law into play, but it didn't apply to any. The other thing I want to tell you about is there's a new sheriff in town, and it's just shameful every time. Let me just read this briefly. April 20th, 2017. This was last year. Maybe you didn't know it. But Secretary Eric A. Hooks of the Department of Public Safety named Kenneth Lassiter as the new director of prisons effective just last May. Lassiter will replace George Solomon, who is retiring after 33 years of service. Lassiter will oversee 55 state prisons that house more than 36,500 inmates. The state prison system has a budget of approximately $1.2 billion and more than 17,000 employees. And this guy is a 28-year corrections veteran. But the thing that stands out for me the most, more than anything else, Scotty, is it's another black man in charge of the largest prison population in the history of humanity right here on planet Earth. The second one now in a row. And he's smiling so happily in his picture where they show him on there. But there's no rhetoric in here about changing anything.
Yeah, so that's why I don't look to unify with people around color of skin. I want to unite with people that's trying to implement justice, and most importantly, trying to end slavery, which would be an implementation of justice. And we just don't simply have justice. And too many people have a vested profit motive in keeping things the way they are. And unfortunately, as you put out, some of those people look like the primary victims of slavery.
Yes, sir. And Scotty, before you read the Abolitionist in Profile speech, I would like you to know that the University of Detroit Mercy, which houses the abolitionist documents that we're reading, also invites people to volunteer to read them so they can put them on the website. So, if you read this tonight, maybe we can get it on their website.
All right. So I'm not sure if this is birth date or death date, October the 4th, or this when he gave the speech.
His me pull it up right here. His October 8th, 1825 is his date of birth. July 29th, 1875 is his date of death. Got it. All right, so our abolitionist in profile tonight for New Abolitionist Radio is Pascal Beverly Randolph, born October the 8th, 1825, and he transitioned on July the 29th, 1875. He was an African-American medical doctor, occultist, spiritualist, trance medium, and writer. He is notable as perhaps the first person to introduce the principles of erotic alchemy to North America, and according to A.E. Waite, establishing the earliest known, now, how would I pronounce this, Rosicrucian order in the United States. Rosicrucian order. When you see the Jesus, white Jesus holding the heart with the cross, that's Rosicrucians. Okay. Dr. Rand, okay, now Max wants me to read a speech by this abolitionist. He gave this speech on October the 4th, 1864, at the proceedings of the National Convention of Colored Men, which was held in the city of Syracuse, New York. Dr. Randolph opened by saying that history constantly repeated itself, that an all-wise providence dictated the paths of which men and nations must pursue, and whenever they willfully forsook those paths, they were certain to be brought back sooner or later by the resistless right hand of the eternal God. The overruling Father brought out the sons of Abraham from Egyptian bondage 3,000 years ago, and today he leads us, the Negro race, with a strong arm from out of the swamps of slavery. He led the Israelites through the Red Sea over sandy wastes into the land of promise and plenty, glorious Canaan. And so now he is leading us and with us, this nation, through the Red Sea of human blood towards the glorious highlands of justice and freedoms. In the olden time, God passed in wrath over Egypt's hoary strand and smote the firstborn of the oppressor with quick and sudden death. And where is the house in this land, whether of the black man or the white? Those lintels and doorposts bear not the red sign, which have not been smitten with the splash of human gore, and yet his paths are plain. Let the nations take warning, God never sleeps. Wherefore let us all take heart. He fights our battles, and where he fights, he wins. Wagner, Hudson, Petersburg, and all the other battles of this war have not been fought in vain. For the dead heroes of those and other bloody fields are the seeds of mighty harvests of human goodness and greatness, yet to be reaped by the nations in the world, and by Afric's sable descendants on the soil of this, our native land. Be of good cheer. Behold the starry flag above our heads. What is it? It is the pledge of heaven that we are coming up from the long dark night of sorrow towards the morning's dawn. It is the rainbow of eternal hope set in our heaven, telling us that we shall never again be drowned in our own salt tears, forced up from our very souls great depths by the worshippers of Moloch, bloody-handed Mammon. It is guaranteed by and from the God of heaven that we, the mourners, may and shall be happy yet. My very soul leaps onward a full century, and its vision falls on fertile fields with no slave driver there, no hearts crushed by fierce oppression, no more heads bowed down. My soul listens already to the glad prelude of a song of triumph, welling up from the myriad of hearts and swelling into a paean that fills the vast concave of heaven itself with the deep-toned melodies of a universal jubilee. The body I now address is to be not only an historical one, but if we do our duty, as we will, the most important in its results and effects, not only upon us here banded together in the firm concord of brotherhood, but to the nations of the world in the ages yet to come.
Here we are met not to hear each other talk, not to mourn over the terrible shadows of the past, but we are here to prove our right to manhood and justice and to maintain these rights, not by force of mere appeal, not by loud threats, not by battle axe and saber, but by the divine right of brains, of will, of true patriotism, of manhood, of womanhood, of all that is great and noble and worth striving for in human character. We are here to ring the bells at the door of the world, proclaiming to the nations, to the white man in his palace, the slave in his hut, kings on their thrones, and to the whole broad universe that we are coming up. Yes, we are at last and going up to stay. He loveth and chasteneth, but he also saves, but saves those first who help themselves. Sheer folly to expect to be raised to a coveted position without self-endeavor. There are two great principles in operation in this world. One is that of progression, the other that of development. One is the body of success, the other is its soul. The one makes us scholars merrily, and the other makes us men. And that only is the pearl for which we are seeking. Progress means acquisition of knowledge, and it is very good if well applied, and yet a man may have 100 libraries by heart. He may be master of 100 sciences, a walking encyclopedia, and yet be a worthless drone in the world. It is not the thought gatherer who makes his mark in the world, but it is the thought producer who is the man of mark and value. Development means persistent culture of our latent powers, and we need it. Slavery and ignorance, liberty and light. It is the mind, not the dollars, that makes the man. Here the orator turned toward the blood-stained flag of the Louisiana Regiment, apostrophized it, spoke of Callux and Ingram who fought and bled upon the field where it waved, and with all his power besought his hearers never to disgrace it by word. And again, that is a speech that was given by Pascal Beverly Randolph, who was born October the 8th, 1825, and transitioned from this earth on July 29th, 1875. And we here at New Abolitionist Radio salute the memory and the words of Pascal Beverly Randolph.
Salute. Man, there was one part of that was so powerful, I think I'll use it as my closing quote. Right. I'll begin with our rider of the 21st Century Underground Railroad. Today it is a Detroit man whose murder conviction was thrown out after he spent 45 years in prison, was exonerated Wednesday, and won't face his second trial. Rich Phillips, 71, was upbeat, saying the criminal justice system works. It just didn't work fast enough. A judge granted the prosecutor's request to permanently drop the case against Phillips, whose conviction was erased last year. He had been free on bond since December. Wayne County Prosecutor Kim Worthy said a new investigation by her office backed his claim that he had no role in the 1971 fatal shooting. She said a key witness lied at this 1972 trial. There's nothing I can say to bring back 40 years of his life, Worthy said. The system failed him. This is a true exoneration. Phillips has spent more years behind bars than any wrongfully incarcerated person in this country. His lawyer, Gabby Silver, told CrimeSider. She describes Phillips, an incredibly warm, engaging person who just wants to pick up the pieces and live a good, quiet life. The case was reopened at the urging of the Innocence Clinic at University of Michigan Law School after a co-defendant at the 72 trial told the state parole board that Phillips wasn't involved in the slaying of Gregory Harris. Phillips likely will be eligible for more than $2 million under Michigan's wrongful conviction law. He is the first person to be exonerated by the Wayne County Prosecuting Attorney's new Conviction Integrity Unit, led by former defense attorney Valerie Newman. I've never carried bitterness around, so I'm not a bitter man, Phillips told reporters when asked about his decades in prison. One of his goals, a reunion with two children who were ages 2 and 4 when he went to prison in 1972. Despite publicity about his case, Phillips said he hasn't heard from them and doesn't know their whereabouts. You have seen the worst and best of the criminal justice system, Judge Kevin Cox told Phillips. And we here at New Abolitionist Radio say, welcome to freedom, Brother Phillips.
Welcome to freedom. And salute to all those who made that possible.
It takes a village. It takes a team. And that's what we really need to be, a team. I'm having a conversation tomorrow afternoon with groups from organizations who are fighting to reduce the prison population by 50% and prison abolitionists. We're going to have a conference call tomorrow, and we're going to try to get on the same page because we need to be.
I agree. So let's go into our final comments so I can prepare to get our next program on air, which is Mind, Body, and Spirit Radio, hosted by Sister Black Rose and Feather Light, heard right here on Black Talk Radio Network. Max, I'll go first, as is customary. Okay.
Yes, sir. I
want to thank Steve Fishman for joining us tonight, and also the young lady who helped make that interview possible by reaching out to me and informing me about the podcast Empire on Blood. You know, without storytellers, stories don't get told. So again, you know, I was talking earlier about the power of words, and we should choose our words wisely. But at the same time, we should use our words to produce justice and expose injustice, because like Dr. King said before he was so viciously taken from us, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Yes, sir. Scotty, I echo your sentiments and appreciations to our callers and our guests. Look out next week, where our guest will be Mustafa Ansari, who is the Dean for the American Institute of Human Rights, and who is also leading the way in the charge for reparations. So that will be next week right here on New Abolitionist Radio. As I said in this speech that was written or spoken 150 years ago by Paschal Beverly Randolph, there was a quote, and I'd like to say it again. Progress means acquisition of knowledge, and it is very good if well applied. And yet a man may have 100 libraries by heart. He may be a master of 100 sciences, a walking encyclopedia, and yet be a worthless drone in the world. It is not the thought gatherer who makes his mark in the world, but it is the thought producer who is the man of mark and value. Paschal Beverly Randolph, our abolitionist in profile. Remember, abolition is a reason for a revolution, so we can finally know peace. Peace.
Rise up, 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 rise up. Showtime. Just lift your eyes up. Let your wise rise, see the signs of the times. If it's time, rise up, rise up. When death and hell dwell among all God's people, when those we chose and trusted have become completely corrupted and inherently evil, when the feast that feeds you starves our father's children, when snuff, porn, and pedo forms begin to get top billing, rise up. When famine claims millions, when justice gives blind eyes to billions, when the Lord's anger is no longer feared, if his protection is gone and your enemies are near, if you've seen the seas spill over and the mountains shake, break, and fall, if the moon ever turns blood red and you can't see the sun at all, rise